Welcome back to Spotlight Bird on Space 101.1 FM. This is the first part of a two-part series where I interview Dr. Rebecca Hartley about bush tits. She is a professor at Seattle U. She also does research on bush tits, especially focusing on their nests, which is the focus of next week's episode. This week, we've got some interesting facts from Dr. Hartley. But first, a quick profile of the birds. Bush tits are extremely light. They weigh as much as a nickel and are 4 times as long as one. They are fluffy little gray birds. They are found in Seattle year-round. That was an excerpt from the Seattle Bird Podcast's episode on bush tits. Listen to that episode after Spotlight Bird for a more detailed technical profile. Coming up now, my interview with Dr. Hartley. How come bush tits are so small? Is there some evolutionary advantage?
That is that's kind of a challenge because in some ways, I think of it as being a disadvantage. I teach physiology, and one of the basic principles in physiology is that the smaller you are, the more food you need per gram of body weight. So even though the absolute amount of food that they need is less than a larger bird, they need more per gram. I think it was in maybe the 70s, something like that. Someone had some bush tits in captivity and reported that they ate 80% of their body weight per day in mealworms, which is an astonishing amount of food. So the smaller you are, like the higher percent relative to your body weight of food you need. So kind of seems like a disadvantage. It's also harder to stay warm when you're small. Um, but the bush tits do have a huddling behavior that they'll do when it's cold. They'll get real close to each other on a branch, and that reduces their surface area exposed to the cold, and that helps them, I think, to stay warm. But the advantage might be a different kind of foraging niche. So bush tits will often forage at the tips of branches, which might be very thin, and I suppose a larger bird might not be able to hang on there as well. I've also seen them hanging upside down and pecking at little aphids on the underside of birch leaves. And so, if you're a big, heavy bird, you wouldn't be able to have that kind of acrobatic ability. So they may be finding some food that wouldn't be available necessarily to other birds.
Can you tell us about the different subspecies of bush tits and which is the one that we have in Seattle?
So the range for the species goes from southern British Columbia all the way down to Guatemala, kind of in the western part of the United States. And I was reading online that there are over 10 subspecies, but I think there are kind of three main ones. There's a Pacific one, which is kind of west of the Cascade Crest. So that would be what we have here in Seattle. And then there's they call it the interior one that's over on the eastern side of the state. And then there's some down south, I guess, like California, Mexico. They actually have a lot of black on their faces, so I think they look quite different from our bush tits here.
Do bush tits have any interesting interspecific interactions?
We do see them in the wintertime when they're foraging in the larger flocks, like 20 or 30 birds together. Sometimes we'll see chickadees in there with them, or kinglets even. So I think sometimes those smaller songbirds will tend to forage together in the winter, and there may be some protection, safety in numbers, or hearing each other's alarm calls might alert them to danger. So we see that in the spring and summer when they're nesting. They seem pretty focused just on building the nests and tending the young ones. In the wintertime, the students and I will walk around campus and just identify and count birds. It's a way for them to learn to identify different birds, and we do the counts, and I submit them eventually to eBird. In the wintertime, it's actually kind of hard to find bush tits. So in the summer, like, we have the nest, and like we know we can go to the nest and see bush tits. But in the wintertime, like, you might see them and you might not. There have been a few years when I was commuting by bus, and I would arrive on campus in the morning around 7:30 when it's just getting light, say in December, January-ish. I would see the bush tits at this patch of flowers that were blooming. Then the next day or a couple days later, I would happen by that patch of flowers again, the same time of day, and they were there again. And so I realized that that seemed to be an important place for them to go first thing in the morning when the sun was coming up. The flowers are a non-native species of Mahonia. In Seattle, or in our location, we have a native species of Mahonia, which is Oregon grape, and that blooms probably in March. But these others, they're from Asia, and hybrids thereof, but they bloom in the middle of the winter. They're promoted as a food source for hummingbirds, and the hummingbirds do like them. You'll definitely see hummingbirds there, but we've also seen warblers there and flocks of bush tits coming in. And initially I thought, oh, they must be finding insects on the flowers because everyone says bush tits are insectivores, right? But then I started thinking, in January it's cold and there really aren't any insects out in January. And, we took a closer look at the flowers and we really were not seeing any insects there at all. And what we did find was there's a little pool of nectar in the bottom of every flower. And I think that's slurping down some nice energy-rich, sugary nectar before they set off on their day. So we were calling it the Bushtit IHOP. The International House of Pancakes is right across the street. So they seem to be going there for breakfast. So that was kind of a cool thing that we've observed. There was a terrible heat wave in Seattle 2 years ago in June, that day that it was 108 in Seattle, 110 or more down in Portland. And Sarah Sloan actually has published a little paper, short note about what happened down there in Portland. But some of the nests were lost. The chicks all died in the heat. It seemed like the nests that were closer to water did better, and the ones that were further away from an open source of water did worse. And that would make sense because water is one way that animals can keep cool. By having water on the surface, it evaporates, it keeps you cool, or just being able to drink water so you can pant, which is kind of like a bird's version of sweating to us, but do that to try to not become hyperthermic in the hot weather. But I think those heat waves are probably going to become more frequent, and that is damaging to birds, especially during the nesting phase when the little ones are so vulnerable.
Would you say the Seattle U campus is like more birds than you'd expect?
I think there are more birds than most people would expect here. I teach a non-majors avian biology class in the spring quarter, and the students are always surprised at what we see. And it's not a ton. It's maybe 10 species for a 45-minute outing. But if you're not familiar with any birds at all, it's pretty eye-opening and exciting for them. And we do see some fun things. Just recently, we saw a flock of cedar waxwings. We've seen a brown creeper recently. Quite a few yellow-rumped warblers, which are kind of cool.
Remember to tune in next week in just over 6 days, 23 hours, and 50 minutes. If you tune in early, just enjoy Space's delightful music. Until next time.